Top of the morning to you. Welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. Russia shoots down 2 armed drones headed for Moscow. Russian forces strikes Ukrainian military command post while Ukraine hits Russian radar stations. Plus, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Ukraine will fight back against Russia in the Black Sea. We begin with news coming out of the Russian capital, Moscow, where its mayor says Russian air defenses shut down 2 armed drones headed for the city. Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin said 1 drone was downed in the Domodedovo area on the southern outskirts of the city, while the second was shot down in the Minsk highway area west of the capital. The Russian state-run TASS news agency also reported the attempted drone attack on Wednesday, citing the country's defense ministry as saying that Ukrainian drones were destroyed in an attempt to attack Moscow. The drone raid was at least the 3rd attempted attack on Moscow within a week. Now, hundreds of firefighters and dozens of vehicles have been deployed to tackle wildfires raging in Yakutia Sakha Republic in Russia's eastern Siberia. According to environmental specialists, up to 27,000 wildfires occur in Siberia every year, covering areas of up to 18 million hectares, causing significant economic and environmental damage. Some fires can be difficult to put out, as they occur in very remote locations, often unreachable. Last year, wildfire smoke blew hundreds of miles to Moscow, affecting city residents. Russia and Ukraine have released battle information. This time, Russia said its forces had struck a Ukrainian military command post, while Ukraine said it had hit Russian radar stations. The Russian Defense Ministry issued a battle report saying the Russian army destroyed Ukrainian military projects, including tanks, armored vehicles, and other equipment in the directions of Kupiansk, Krasny Liman, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. The Russian forces also hit a Ukrainian command post on the front line. The Russian air defense troops intercepted 5 HIMARS multiple rocket launchers and 17 unmanned drones from Ukraine. On the other hand, the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces issued a report on their part, saying that in the past 24 hours, the Ukrainian army carried out strikes on Russian troops and equipment, concentration areas, destroying a Russian Ka-52 helicopter, 2 reconnaissance drones, 5 artillery, and 2 radar stations. Now in eastern Ukraine, where at least 3 people have been killed and several others wounded in Donetsk region after the shelling of the Russian-controlled city intensified. Russian-installed Donetsk Mayor Alexei Kalemzin said in a statement posted on Telegram that a bus stop, a hospital, a store, and residential areas were hit in 4 city districts, adding that 7 residents were wounded, including an 11-year-old boy. The city of Donetsk has been under Russian control since 2014, but Ukrainian troops continue to hold positions on its outskirts, and the city regularly comes under artillery fire. Meanwhile, an 18-year-old man has been killed and 3 other men wounded after Russian shelling hit the southern Ukrainian district of Nikopol. Serhiy Lysak, head of the Regional Military Administration, said those injured had suffered mine blast trauma and shrapnel wounds. He adds that the shelling also damaged power lines, homes, and a church. Ukrainian soldiers fired U.S.-provided self-propelled howitzers in the south of Donetsk region as the temperatures rose to around 35 degrees Celsius. Now, according to Ukraine's commander-in-chief, Ukrainian troops are creating conditions to advance forward step by step and have the initiative on the battlefield. Despite the heat wave, with temperature in the mid to high 30 degrees Celsius, Ukrainian soldiers battle on regardless. Ukraine launched a counter-offensive at the start of the summer, attempting to retake swathes of territory captured by Russia in the south and the east of the country. The United States and other Western allies have sent Ukraine weapons and trained Ukrainian soldiers to help Kyiv with the offensive. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says that Ukraine will fight back against Russia in the Black Sea to ensure its waters were not blockaded, and it could import and export grain and other goods. This comes days after Ukrainian maritime drones packed with explosives damaged a Russian warship near a major Russian port and struck a Russian tanker. Russian drones and missiles have repeatedly struck Ukrainian port facilities and grain silos.
If Russia continues to dominate the Black Sea outside its territory, blockading or firing at us again, launching missiles at our ports, Ukraine will do the same. This is a just defense of our opportunities of any corridor. We have warned that Ukraine doesn't want any war, and that if they start firing, we don't have that many ships. But they should clearly understand that by the end of the war, they will have 0 ships, 0, if they don't stop killing Ukraine's civilian population.
Now, residents of Ukraine's Danube River port town of Ismail are cleaning up rubble 6 days after Russian drone strikes on grain export infrastructure. Ismail is a key port in the Danube Delta, from where Ukrainian grain is taken by barge to the Romanian Black Sea port of Constanta for shipment onwards. Ukraine's Danube River ports became a vital lifeline for Ukraine's grain exports after Russia left the Black Sea grain deal in mid-July. Russia has in recent weeks targeted the Black Sea port of Odessa, where the Ukrainian Navy is headquartered, and Ismail, Ukraine's main island port across the Danube River from Romania, damaging port infrastructure and grain facilities. Now let's talk to Dr. Tom Rossett, head of the Ukraine program, Norwegian Defence University College, joining us from Oslo in Norway. Good morning, and thank you for being with us.
Good morning, and thank you for inviting me.
Now, the temperatures, if we begin from there, under which some of the forces on both sides are fighting, we understand is as high as 35 degrees Celsius. For our viewers, if it's hot in Lagos in southwest Nigeria, where I am, it's 31 degrees Celsius. If it gets beyond 31 degrees, then we're talking about a major heat wave. It can dabble between 29 and 28 if it's getting a lot colder in other parts of the Nigeria, especially in the northern region. But now that these conditions, and I think that's what precipitated the wildfires in the Siberian part of Russia, how do you think the troops are coping under these very harsh conditions?
I think they're coping fairly well. Yes, there are challenges. Yes, there are heat waves. There's also been, well, in the winter it was very cold as well, so they have to just endure the situation as it is. It creates some challenges. I would say that the cold is stronger limitation to the forces and how the equipment works than the heat, but of course it creates challenges for the troops as well, and it's a bit similar to the cold. You have to do your you have to drink a lot. You have to have proper training how to fight under such conditions. But it's something they should be trained to do, and they should be managed fairly well on both sides, I would say. So it's not that it limits the fighting. We still see a high intensity of fighting, although the border or the line of conflict is not moving that much.
Speaking of the winter in that region that is fast coming upon us in that part of the country, it's one of the reasons why it was underestimated by the German Nazi forces when they tried to take Russia the way they did, and they didn't take that into account, and it caused them the defeats that they suffered in World War II. But now concerning this particular conflict, last year, it was the Russians were attacking Ukrainian energy infrastructure. This year, do you think the Ukrainians are prepared for any onslaught?
They are prepared, but how can you prepare if you don't have sufficient air defense? And I think they have a good amount of air defense. They've been providing from the West very capable systems, but they can't cover it all. As we see now, they hit grain infrastructure, and there are parts of Ukraine that doesn't have that good coverage from missiles and drones that the Russians keep sending in waves now and then. So concerning the winter, I think we will see another effort by Russia to use the cold as a weapon and try to damage first Ukrainian energy facilities and electricity grids. And second, I think also Russia would consider to shut down the energy supplies to Europe as well concerning gas. So Russia will try to pressure both the assisting countries and the Ukraine itself.
Dr. Rossett, are you concerned by the latest comments from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky over the Black Sea, where obviously Russia has the advantage because of its occupation of the Crimean area and the Crimean Peninsula? Do you think that Ukraine is going to engage Russia in a naval battle on the Black Sea now? Do they have the naval wherewithal to do so? Do they have enough ships, warships?
Ukraine has very limited capability and capacity to challenge Russia. As you indicate, I mean, it's very few, they have very few ships, very small ships, coastal ships mostly, Coast Guard-ish ships, and small boats with missiles. But what Ukraine can do is that they have two sort of important assets, and one is naval missiles that they have developed themselves. The Neptune missile, it's having a reach of around 200 kilometers, maybe a bit more, and that has sunk a couple of Russian ships, and is an effective sort of deterrence and denial tool. Another one that we have seen employed recently in the Kerch Strait area is naval drones that go on the surface and have a very long distance, around 450 kilometers, and can hit the Russian vessels if they stand still or moving very predictably. So the Ukrainians have the ability to make damage to the Russian naval fleet, and thus also shipments that go to and from Russian ports if they carry weapons, supplies, and things like that to the Russian war effort. So there's a capability there, and it's not as effective as the Russian one, of course, but it's still there and could be damaging also the Russian economy and activity in the Black Sea as a response to what Russia is doing.
It does appear that those underwater drones seem to be working, though Russia doesn't admit it. How much damage is being done by way of the number of ships affected by this is up in the air, because Russia doesn't admit as much. But should President Zelensky, at the risk of sounding conciliatory, should he rather wait for instance, the intervention of Turkey and Erdogan for the restoration of the Black Sea grain deal, rather than take up arms on the seas? We know how expensive an enterprise naval warfare is. China has about over 400 warships, and that's as big as China is. So a warship is very expensive to have. Also, should Ukraine be asking for assistance by way of supply of naval warfare equipment and ships?
I think that's a good question. I think Ukraine, and it's in Ukraine's interest to make the negotiations position as good as possible for Ukraine prior to going into these talks with Turkey and the UN, and then indirectly with Russia. So I think Russia should also see the consequences of its actions, that it gets also affected by the decision it does towards Ukraine, and Ukraine can answer. Yes, it escalates the situation, but it's also a natural response from Ukraine, demonstrating that it has, in an asymmetric way, it doesn't have the same means as Russia, but asymmetrically it can respond and threaten also Russian supplies and trade through the Black Sea. And through that, I think it gains a better hand in the negotiations, and possibly potentially getting a better deal, or at least a back to normal deal, if Turkey managed to do so, considering the fairly good relationship between Erdogan and Putin.
I'd really like your opinion on this just concluded Saudi Arabia conference, to which Russia was not invited, but China attended. Russia has said in no uncertain terms that it's dead on arrival, it's not going to work, and that they are obviously just playing to the gallery for, that is, Ukraine, proposing that their own peace plan should be considered above the other peace plans of other nations, which Russia says is undermined by Ukraine, ignored by Ukraine even, as opposed to their own peace plan. What's your impression of the Saudi Arabia intervention?
My impression that it's a good step forward. It has created at least a room, a forum. This is the second meeting. The previous one was in Copenhagen. Then China did not participate. So having the talks in Saudi Arabia, which has good relations with both China and Russia, by the way, I think that was a good decision. And my understanding of the talks is that it was they gained a sort of a common understanding of the challenges, that the integrity of Ukraine should be respected according to the UN Charter. That's something that's obvious in many ways, but it's not that's something that many countries would say directly concerning Ukraine, considering their relationship with Russia. So I think it was a good step, an initial step, and I also have the feeling that China moved a bit away from the Russian sturdy position. Russia demands the 4 oblast or districts it has annexed from Ukraine, and that's something that they stand fairly alone with, although Some have just tacitly not supported this or expressed their genuine opinion. They've been sort of objectively on the sideline. But this forum then created a sort of a common ground on that this is unacceptable. Although the common statements from the forum didn't come, but that was sort of the common ground that I sensed came out of the meeting, and that's a good initial step for a future peace settlement.
Speaking of Norway, where you are, what's the official position? We know that European countries are key allies of Ukraine.
In Norway, and together with a lot of NATO countries and the European Union, are heavily supporting Ukraine's position in that this war has been unprovoked. It has Russia has taken territory and has territorial ambitions that it has no right to have. Ukraine is a sovereign nation with its own rights, according to also the UN Charter, and it's in Europe's interest to help Ukraine defend itself. Our fear is that if we don't stop Russia in Ukraine, assist Ukraine in stopping Russia, then Russia will be on our threshold, for example, Norway or other states closer to Russia in the next phase. So if we don't stand up now, the security in Europe will be worse in, for example, a decade from now. So it's a very decisive moment for Europe, and the European security architecture will depend on what happens in this war moving ahead.
When you say Russia has territorial ambitions, are you saying that Russia, let's paint a worst case scenario picture. God forbid that Ukraine loses the war and Russia absorbs parts of Ukraine, or however it pans out to be, that Russia will then go on to invade other nations, including European nations? Is that what you're saying, by saying that Russia has territorial ambitions?
I think the Russian territorial ambition is first and foremost the former Soviet Union. We then talk about Moldavia, and then also about Georgia. That's the countries that would be the next natural ambition for Russia, with their Russian minorities within these countries. So I think Russia would be an authoritarian state with huge self-confidence if it won this war, and it would also first and foremost be a threat towards Moldova and Georgia, but also potentially towards NATO countries. And it's not that it would attack directly, but it would increase its activities under the Article 5 in NATO. That means that that will ignite a military response, or attack against one is an attack against all, but have activities challenging European security below that threshold. That's something that would increase in such a situation, and we're moving then back to something similar. It's not the same, but something similar like the Cold War with the Soviet Union and the West. So the prospects for European security is quite bad at the moment, but as I said, a lot will depend on this war and how it develops.
Doctor, are there any points of mutual convergence because of the fact that millions of Ukrainians have been displaced, because of the fact that thousands of civilians have been killed, that one also in the process of the mediation and looking at the peace plans proposed by the African Peace Mission, proposed by China, proposed by Brazil, some of the recommendations that they are bringing forth, that Ukraine, because of its proximity to Russia, is one of the key reasons why Russia is so uncomfortable with the NATO ambitions of Ukraine, for one, and also considering the alleged intentions of Ukrainian Russians or Russians in Luhansk and Donetsk region, who have said, according to those referendum, which obviously is being contested, and the referendum in Crimea, also described as a sham referendum, that there are elements in Ukraine that say they want to be a part of Russia or more sympathetic to Russia. Is there any way that you see that some of these considerations can be looked at again?
I think we, at some point, and depending on the developments on the ground, there will be increased voices for a peace plan and a ceasefire first and foremost. For the moment, that will benefit Russia. But as you said, I mean, at some point this will move into politics again. And the peace plan would have to be developed. And if sort of the situation is quite static, that you have a permanent static war along a front line that seems pretty similar like today, then it's hard to imagine that Russia will step back and give the territory back to Ukraine. But I think the aggressor should not be rewarded. That's the first. At the same time, I mean, as you mentioned, there are elements in Ukraine in the south and the east that are pro-Russian. At least they used to be. I mean, this war has changed Ukraine a lot. It has been a nation, a state building in Ukraine prior to the war. I mean, or prior to the invasion. Since 2014, Russia has been at war with Ukraine, and in that period, since 2014, Ukraine has really strengthened itself and its national consciousness. So I think Ukraine is something different now, and also in the areas in the south and the east, the opposition against Russia has gained momentum. When we talk about the occupied territories, Crimea, yes, it's been dominated by ethnic Russians, but they initially also didn't want to be part of Russia prior to the invasion. And in the Donbass, in Donetsk and Luhansk, the ethnic Russians were around 40%. So I think there's a lot of misperceptions about these regions wanting to go to Russia. They wanted, first and foremost, a romantic relationship with what once was the Soviet Union. And that's something that's not here anymore. I think we have to look at these areas in a Ukrainian, first and foremost, way. But of course, some self-determination and rights for Russian language and things like that. That's something that has always been on the table, but the Russian side has sort of made information campaigns that this was unsustainable and so forth.
Dr. Tom Rosseth, thank you so much for your insight on this conflict.
Thank you.
Dr. Tom Rassett, the head of the Ukrainian program, Norwegian Defense University College, who joined us from Oslo in Norway. After the break, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken says Russia's free grain offer to African nations laughable. Details in a moment. Please. Welcome back. You're watching Russian invasion of Ukraine. Ukrainian authorities are urging residents in the eastern city of Kupiansk to evacuate the children and those with limited mobility following a recent escalation of Russian attacks. At least 3 civilians were killed and 9 others injured this week after Russian missiles hit a village near the city in the Kharkiv region, which was liberated by Ukrainian forces last year. Andriy Besedin, head of the Kupiansk City Military Administration, said starting from the deoccupation in September 2022, the Kupiansk community has been constantly suffering from shelling. Dozens of second-hand Leopard 1 tanks that once belonged to Belgium have been bought by another European country for Ukrainian forces fighting Russia's invasion. That's according to the arms trader who did the deal. Freddie Verslius, the CEO of defense company OIP Land Systems, bought the German-made tanks from the Belgian government more than 5 years ago. He said he'd now sold all 50 tanks to another European government, which he could not name due to a confidentiality clause. He said he also could not disclose the price. The Leopard 1 was made by German firm Krauss-Maffei starting in the 1960s. It's lighter than the Leopard 2 and has a different type of gun. The models sold by the individual in question were last upgraded in the 1990s. U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has criticized Moscow for its offer to supply 6 African nations with free grain, saying the proposal is laughable. Speaking in an interview with Mr. Blinken, in his words, what Russia was proposing was to get grain to a half-dozen countries, about 50,000 tons. He adds the Black Sea Grain Initiative delivered 20 million tons to lower and middle-income countries. In other words, what the Russians were proposing in compensation for getting out of the agreement is a drop in the bucket of what countries were getting and what they need. Russia's finance ministry says the budget deficit for January to July widened to 2.82 trillion rubles, or 1.8% of the GDP. Despite posting a surplus of 557 billion rubles in the first 7 months of last year, significant outlays to support its war in Ukraine and Western sanctions on its oil and gas have affected state finances. A government document shows Russia has doubled its 2023 defense spending target to more than $100 billion, a third of all public expenditure. And now let's join Ini John Mekwa, who's with me in the studio for a business perspective on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Ini, good morning.
Good morning.
Could we begin with the comment from the U.S. Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, calling it laughable, Russia's offer to supply free grain for some period to 6 African nations? He was putting it in the context as though that's an alternative to the Black Sea grain deal, but that was never the intention of Russia in this regard. It's a totally different kettle of fish. They were specifically talking about those African countries and not the larger picture of other countries that also are to benefit from
the grain
export.
Yeah, well, I guess why he put it that way is the grain that comes through the Black Sea also had also ends up in some of those African countries. I mean, countries like Egypt largely depend on grains that come from the Black Sea, you know, wheat and all of that from both countries. So yes. I guess that's what he was talking about. But I mean, we've talked about these promises from Russia a whole lot on this show. Yes. Why we should be careful about it. And some even said, I mean, how real is it? I remember I spoke to an economist on this, and he says, well, he doesn't even see it being real because as part of even what we have to discuss today, logistics of transporting crops or goods from Russia is getting more and more expensive. You know, as you know, the sanctions are biting in and increasing. Sometimes you don't even know when they've added some other ones. Companies are being targeted, insurance companies, logistics companies. Remember, we talked about how dairy products, how Russia as a government itself is promising to take up the expenses of that, because that has been a major deterrent, you know, to local producers of dairy products. So when Russia is giving free grain to Africans, you look at the distance from Russia to Africa, how much it will cost Russia. Talking about, apart from the grains itself, assuming that they have the grains at cheaper rates, then how much it will cost them, talking about the logistics, you know, to move it, and then they're doing all of that. So, I mean...
He's looking at the cup half empty.
Maybe he's being realistic, because this is the reality.
Maybe he's being pessimistic.
Maybe it's time to be pessimistic. It's war, for crying out loud. Economies are suffering, getting bitten on every side. So
what about these countries that actually need that grain?
They do need the grain, Olumide. Nobody's saying they don't need the grain, and we should try to get the grain across to them, but we just want to be real and say, why is Russia giving you free grain?
Obvious reasons.
Number one,
to ramp up their influence in the region and their support.
And their support, but it must have a bottom line. This is business.
Yes.
They have something they want to gain. They're not doing it for free altogether. You need to find that out.
I don't think anyone is under that impression.
Exactly.
They're doing it for free.
No, but I mean, if they say they're going to give you free grain, it's supposed to be unattached, nothing attached. It's supposed to be free all through.
Yeah, it'll be free for that purpose.
On the surface.
But they know that there's something.
So these are the issues. So this one, Mr. Blinken, is, you know, and a lot of people see this as not a very serious proposal or promise by Russia, because eventually it costs them a whole lot to do that. Apart from the farmers and the companies that are producing the grain, getting it across to Africa is a major one. And if you say Africa should take up the responsibility of getting it from Russia to their destination, you also have the African countries, of course, facing all of this. And that is even a whole lot of expenses. And you have more shipping companies, you have more insurance companies cutting off from doing business with Russia. You know, even in Russia, for Russians to do their exports, it's gotten really expensive, you know, for logistics.
The United States is never going to commend Russia for anything.
I know.
Okay,
so you're trying to play the devil's advocate here now?
No, I don't like that devil.
Okay.
So, listen, an advocate nonetheless.
Okay, all right.
Romania promises to help Ukraine with the export of grain. We know that Poland has done so. Yeah. We know Bulgaria, the other countries. Obviously, this is the alternative at the expiration of the Black Sea grain deal. Yeah. Terrestrial export of the grain. Yeah. Terrestrial evacuation is what they're proposing.
Yeah, no, they also have, I think they also have marine somewhere across the border. Okay, so I think they're trying to also see how they can develop all of that. They're still in talks. Obviously, there's the need to boost some infrastructure, because, I mean, parties, everyone were looking the way of the Black Sea, and nobody really looked at the alternative. So it is now that countries have to start looking for how to develop. So I think Romania does have a marine alternative to it that they can also add to the road infrastructure and all of that. But some of these things do need development and boosting before they can actually carry out. But at least, the good thing for Ukraine in this case is that countries, Poland, as you mentioned, and now Romania, are looking for ways to help, you know, and try to get the grains out of Ukraine to the countries that need it. So this is in talks, but obviously to need some infrastructural development before the route can be cleared. But at least there's no insecurity along along that route, I guess.
Earlier, we spoke about Russian exports to China dropping in July, the first time since the war started. Now, China is arguably one of their biggest allies.
Yeah.
Why is the export dropping?
Well, China has its own problems at this time. So generally, exports from China has dropped about 12%. But out of those 12%, 8% is allocated to Russia. So yes, China is, by data, the biggest trading partner with Russia. So now China is, I mean, their PMI, their manufacturing activity has dropped. They're also having their own issues at this time. Their economy is not at the best. So we cannot say that this is specifically because of Russia. We can say that because activities have dropped in China. And you know, because China is very well coordinated, so when you see their data, it reflects what's going on there. Remember when they closed part of their activity, economic activities, because they wanted to curtail the spread of COVID-19, and we saw that, and because they are a major consumer of oil and gas. So once they do anything like that, we see it in the price of oil, we see it in the demand of oil. So that's what is also reflecting here in their exports. But the thing is, that's their imports of Russian goods. That's the, you know, mostly it's petroleum products that they get from Russia. But their export into Russia seems to have increased a bit. It's not going down with it. So, you know, Russia has been trying to balance the trade, because what happened immediately after the war was China and India, they just started exporting, especially refined crude from Russia. You know, sometimes I think it gets to a saturating point. We've seen that in India's case, but in this case, China is facing its own economic slowdown at this time, and so they are. But we see that their exports into Russia hasn't really gone down.
As part of this, China never had it so good, have they? At least in the modern century, economically speaking, militarily speaking, they're in a position of strength now more than ever before.
Yeah. Yes.
At least in the last 20 years.
Yes, they are. And I guess, I mean, sometimes they talk of their population. Thank God you said in the last 20 years. We were having a conversation yesterday, and they said in 20 years ago, if they told you to drive a Chinese-made car, you would say, oh, God forbid, or something like that. But, you know, see where they are. What did they do? What did they do? They looked inwards. And now they are the second largest consumer of crude oil, and they're using it for production. And we see, what do they sell to Russia? They sell computers. You know, they sell all of those. Where did they get it from? It's the brains. You know, some people in Nigeria, I spoke to some manufacturers, and they told me how they have to import all those bolts and nuts. And when you go to China, what happens is you just see a little room, you know, that you can hardly call a factory. And that's where they're making those bolts and nuts that Nigerians are importing into Nigeria. You understand? And you see maybe very young people, I mean, if you watch their documentaries, you see how focused and intentional their school system is. They ensure that you're not just looking at the words, but these words must mean something that can affect the economy. If you're reading engineering, they show you, what do you do with that engineering? What can you produce? How will it, who needs it? You know, and
you compare China's natural resources to other countries, such as Nigeria.
Oh, don't even go there.
Doesn't even hold a candle
at all
to these,
you know, at all. Even apart from China, look at a country like UK. What do they have? It's services. Over 90% of UK economy is built on services.
It's incredible. Ini, thank you so much. Ini John Mekwa.
Thank you.
When we return,
we're unblocked.
Latvian president visits Belarus and Russia borders. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. The final stretch of today's special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Latvian President Edgar Rinkovich has visited the border with Belarus and Russia, where he spoke with guards stationed along the fence separating the Baltic country from its eastern neighbors. Rinkovich stated that the significant amount of provocation from Russia and Belarus has led his country to enhance its border surveillance, especially in the context of Wagner troops relocated to Belarus. In 2021 and 2022, NATO and EU countries neighboring Belarus, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania faced a surge of border incursions from migrants. And finally on the program, Georgia marked the 15th anniversary of its 5-day war with Russia, events which led to 1/5 of the South Caucasian country being occupied by pro-Russian forces to the present day. Georgia Prime Minister condemned Russia's illegal occupation and aggression at an official ceremony at the location on the outskirts of the Georgian capital, Tbilisi, where soldiers killed in the 2008 war are buried. Georgia launched an assault on militants in South Ossetia on August 7, 2008, after days of skirmishes and months of tension between Moscow and Tbilisi over it and the rebel Black Sea region of Abkhazia, which both sought to break away in wars in the early 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Russia responded with a devastating counterstrike that routed the Georgian army. The 5-day war killed at least 390 civilians. At its height, it displaced more than 100,000 people. And that's our midweek edition of our coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Many thanks for watching. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Have a good day and do join us again tomorrow.